Welcome to the Better Brain Podcast, where we talk about all things brain health for anyone who has a brain or knows someone who does and wants to make it better.
Today's guest is a good one. His name is Dr. Jack Feldman. He's Distinguished Professor of Neurobiology at UCLA and a world expert on breathing and respirations.
He discovered the pre-Botzinger complex, which is a tiny little part of the brain in the brainstem that tells us how we breathe, when we breathe, the pattern of breathing. And we went deep into that and so many other things about breathing.
Yeah, specific breathing techniques like box breathing and different things that you can do from a respiration standpoint that might improve anxiety, stress, and even sleep.
Turns out breathing is free and you could do it anytime, anywhere. And it turns out that it has a ton of benefits and almost no adverse effects.
We had a great one. We hope you guys check it out. Let's go.
Dig in.
The general public is not really aware of the power that breathwork has. And it's probably in the past 15 years that people begin to realize the powerful effects that breathing have.
Yeah.
And then they, in turn, realized it was happening in the brain.
Yeah.
Not in the lung, not in the circulation.
Yeah.
And that's how I got pulled into this.
So when you say thousands of years, can you expand on that? And
yeah, well,
what do you mean by that?
In Asian culture, where they were doing meditation, breath work was a critical component of it. It wasn't called breath work, but a lot of meditative practices involve controlling your breathing, focusing on your breathing, holding your breath and whatnot. And this was so integrated to the meditative practices that it wasn't thought of separately. But now, as people begin to sort of parse it out, it turns out that a lot of the benefits that are attributed to meditation follow from just a pure breathwork practice.
Yeah.
And to me, the breathwork practice has the advantage is that it's very low threshold to get into. You don't have to buy into a belief system. You don't need instruction. You can get a simple app. So basically, it's immediately accessible to everyone. It's a little bit like exercise. You know, people can't do it, play golf from never having done that before. They have to sort of get into it. They have to, someone who's been a couch potato, you don't tell them to run a marathon. You say, walk around the room, walk around the block. Yeah. And with breath work, you can say very simple things that people can do for 5 minutes. And many people report that they feel that something does change that's beneficial. And that's how they get into the practice.
Yeah, well, it's one of those things that if you were to say, look, I'm going to prescribe you a pill and it's free, you could take it anywhere, anytime, as many times as you want. And every time you do it, you're going to get, 5 or 6 different benefits immediately, and probably some benefits. You practice this for a long term in the long haul. And the adverse effects are almost nothing.
That's one of your favorite points.
You summarized this whole podcast. I can leave now.
Yeah. That's one of his favorite points. You make that point pretty much
with exercise.
For exercise, for everything on every single podcast. But back to meditation, it always seems though that people understood even during that time that, a core tenet of meditation is breathing, focusing on the breathing. So certainly when you're focusing on something, you understand its importance. So it seems like even back then, they really understood the importance of breath.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I think what's happened more recently is that people have found all these interesting things going on in the brain that are tied to breathing. So maybe about 15, 20 years ago, people recording activity in the cortex, which is far away from the brainstem where the generation of the breathing rhythm comes from, they found the nervous system had oscillations that were breathing related, that were phase related to breathing. And initially, I think people felt this was epiphenomenal, didn't have any effect on the way the brain worked. And subsequent investigation showed that those signals played a key role in the way the brain process information. And so from that, it's not a stretch to say, if that's involved in your normal way your brain is processing information and behaving, what happens when you change it? And it turns out when you change it in particular ways, you get changes in the way the brain is acting. And many of those changes are very positive. You become calmer, you're less anxious, you're less depressed. So there's no a priori reason that breathing should have that effect, but it just does. So why don't we take advantage of it?
Yeah, incredible.
It's one of those things that's in the background of our lives. Every moment. It's reliable, as you've said in many other episodes. But the idea that it could actually be playing a role, it could be controlled and used as a tool. That's pretty surprising. I think some people might say breathing. That's not interesting. Why do you?
I get that all the time. I mean,
why do you find it interesting?
You still get breathing isn't interesting? You still get
no.
that?
I mean,
No.
I think I have a slide that do we have the slides?
Did you send it to us?
Yeah, I got it.
Yeah.
Okay. So that's sort of a choice. Okay. So breathing may look simple, but it's not. So you can just click. So suppose you have a two-handed watch. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
How does it work? Well, you say, okay, you just unwind the spring. That would gradually cause the arms to rotate, and that's how the watch works. So that's the explanation of how it works. But if you look inside a real watch, that's what it looks like. And why does a real watch have to look like that? Well, a real watch has to do more than, and this is sort of a much more complicated watch, but a real watch has to do a lot of things. Not only does it have to rotate the hands, it has to do it very precisely, very accurately. It has to deal with shock. It has to be able to reset. And you can't do that with a simple spring. You got to have this very complicated mechanism. And it's the same thing with breathing. To do the basic generation of the breathing rhythm is actually complicated because it has to work from the time you're born. In fact, it has to work during your third trimester, because if you're not generating movements in utero, your lung is not going to develop properly. So you generate it before you're born. It has to work when you're born. And it has to work 1 billion times during your lifetime without stopping for more than a few seconds. And so how do you build something like that? How do you build something that's extraordinarily robust but very labile? If you go and exercise, you can double or triple your ventilation in one breath in terms of frequency. Your heart rate takes many seconds in order to double. So how do you build a system that's robust and yet extremely labile? Well, it's complicated.
Yeah. Why don't we circle back to why do humans need to breathe? How does it relate to any sort of evolutionary processes? You mentioned we're breathing already or functioning as breathing in utero. Give us some insight into that.
Okay. So let's just start with mammals. Okay. The engine for energy involves the use of oxygen. You have to use oxygen. You need oxygen for that. It's oxidative metabolism. So the question is, how do you get oxygen into the cells? There's oxygen in the room air. It's about 21% of room air is oxygen. But you got to get it into the body. And we have to get it deep into the body. And so the way it evolved in vertebrates is they developed lungs, and they were able to get air into the lung, and then the heart pumped it out through the body through the interaction of the blood with oxygen binding to hemoglobin in the red blood cells. And then when it gets to the tissue, the oxygen gets released and gets into the cells. And then a byproduct of oxidative metabolism is carbon dioxide. You got to get that out of the body. So here the lung acts in the opposite direction. That is, the blood flows back to the lung, goes into the air sacs in the lung, and then you exhale it. And it's very important both to get in enough oxygen and to get out enough the CO2, because the carbon dioxide regulates the acid-base balance of the blood and the whole body. And every cell in your body is extremely sensitive to the local acid-base status, the pH. And so if your body really needs to regulate the carbon dioxide level very precisely, and it does that primarily through breathing, and over a slower time scale, using the kidneys and the excretion of bicarbonate and hydrogen ions to regulate that aspect of carbon dioxide bicarbonate balance.
So on that point, just for a second, so it's not just the breathing rate, but also breathing depth that will
That's right.
control it?
So we tend to think of the key parameters ventilation, which is sort of the number of breaths you're taking per unit time and the depth of each inspiration. So you can breathe, typically people breathing 10 to 15 times per minute at about 500 cc's per minute. 500 cc is about the size of my fist. So when you take a normal breath, You take in 500 cc's of air, of which 20% of that is oxygen. And when you exhale 500 cc's. Now, you can do that 12 breaths per minute, 500 cc's. That's about 5 liters per minute, 6 liters per minute. Or you could double your breathing frequency and just take smaller breaths. So when you pant, you're still removing the same amount of air. It's a little bit more complicated than that, same amount of air. But one of the reasons you might choose to pant is panting is a way you can control your body temperature, because there's a lot of
Moisture.
Thank you. There's a lot of moisture in your airways, and when you evaporate the moisture, it's cooling. And so humans sweat, primates sweat, but most mammals don't sweat. So dogs and horses, you notice that then when they exercise and their body heats up, they have to go into this panting mode. But the panting mode is regulated not only just to lower the temperature, but also to make sure you're getting enough oxygen and blowing off enough carbon dioxide. And if you don't regulate that precisely, you can have dysregulation of body function.
So there's enough variables there, the parameters of ventilation, that you could really, if you're one person from the next, one size to the next, one gender or sex to the next, breathe in a very different pattern, or one moment to the next.
There was an interesting paper just published by Noam Sobel from Israel. What he did was he characterized the breathing pattern of, I think, a few hundred people in great detail. And it basically acted as a fingerprint. Once he had their data, anytime they would come back into the lab or he would get their breathing pattern, he could identify them amongst the population of several hundred people. Wow. So we all have basically a breath print. The breath print may not be obvious between the three of us, there's someone just watching, but if we measured it in detail, not only would it be different, it would be highly individualistic.
What are those attributes that factor into someone's breath pattern or breath characteristics? And then what does it mean in terms of, their health?
Can you predict their
health
health from their breath print?
They're not there yet.
Please.
They're
Please,
not.
Let me finish the statement.
They're not there yet, but in the paper they speculate that is a possibility, that it may be diagnostic.
They're not there yet for the statement that he finished of mine, or they're not there yet in terms of understanding the attributes that, or personality characteristics or characteristics in general, that they come in with that influences their breathing characteristics.
Well, they measured, I don't remember the number of parameters, let's say 20, 30, 40.
Okay.
And they get a profile. And then you go off and I measure it again. And I say, okay, who is the person breathing? They have that profile. They use some AI, and that identifies you. So the key parameters that are obvious is depth of breathing, frequency of breathing, the duration of inspiration, the duration of expiration, the airflows. So those are all the variability. So, at rest, we have a regular breathing pattern, but it's just like heart rate variability, which is not exactly the same from cycle to cycle.
Right.
Your breathing duration is not exactly the same from cycle to cycle. It varies.
Yeah.
And here again, that's idiosyncratic. So all these things come into play. And they speculated that it could be diagnostic, but they didn't have really the definitive data yet.
I pulled this figure from a paper that was recently published that is looking at how breathing patterns affect functional MRI, because functional MRI is based on blood flow to the brain and different brain regions and how those get activated in different conditions, including rest, and how, as you said in the beginning, just breathing itself might not be a background element, but might be a causative element to brain activity. And so they're trying to understand this. And if you look on the left, there's different breathing patterns that you might see in different conditions, opioid use, stroke, heart failure, and so on, high altitude. And then on the right are several different participants' breathing patterns where that green line is a minute of time each. And they're all very different, kind of speaking to your point about a breath print, where there's variability, there's some metronome-like qualities, difference in rate and depth. It's fascinating.
And when you notice the ones that are not healthy, so the bottom two are healthy persons, that if you detect that, it's very alarming because it's usually indicative of some rather serious health problem.
Yeah. So if we're talking about all this variability, are there core tenets of breathing patterns that you would deem as overall good or associated with health?
I'm not sure I understand the question, Dave.
So we're saying, oh, okay, all these there's all this variability relating to breathing. What does healthy breathing look like?
Oh,
Would you say?
healthy breathing is very metronomic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now we're talking about at rest, not being distracted. Your breathing pattern is changing all the time because you're doing stuff, your body's moving.
Yeah.
You have a thought, snaps into your head that may change your breathing pattern. But basically, it's 10 to 15 times per minute, 500 cc's per breath, and that's sort of the baseline for, a 50-kilo, 25-year-old male. It'll be different for a woman, 40-kilo, 25-year-old woman will be a little bit different. And that's just sort of ballparking it. But there'll be variability amongst individuals or in the same individual from day to day, and also depending on their health status. They get an upper respiratory infection, they're going to change their breathing pattern.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything special about how humans breathe?
Well, I would say maybe primates and humans, of course, because we speak, we have this very complex upper airway. So if you look at a rodent, the airway is straight. So it goes from the mouth, it's straight. For us, it comes in the mouth and nose and whoosh, makes that right turn. And so the upper airways in humans are not really designed for breathing. They're designed for all the other stuff we're doing. And for speech, for chewing, for whatnot. And so the nervous system has to be able to control all of these things. And breathing, because of this complexity of the right angle and the fact that the tongue takes up a lot of space in the airways, and we have to be able to use the tongue not only for speech and various reflexes, but we have to regulate it for breathing. So during inspiration, the tongue normally pulls away from the back of the airway to make it easier to the air to come in. It opens the airways. During expiration, it actually relaxes back a little bit. And when it relaxes back a little bit, it restricts the airways, slowing down the flow of air out of the lungs, which means the lungs stay inflated a little bit longer, making breathing a little bit more efficient. Where it goes awry is in sleep apnea, obstructive sleep apnea. And what happens is that when you go in various stages of sleep, your body muscle tone can get reduced. So it doesn't matter if it's your limbs, but if it's your tongue, particularly if you're lying on your back, the tongue is going to collapse against the airway. You're going to snore, and if it gets bad, it'll collapse to the point to obstruct the airways. About 4% of adult males have obstructive sleep apnea to the point that it's unhealthy. Most women are unlikely to have sleep apnea until they go through menopause. And then their rates of sleep apnea rise to be pretty close to that of men. And so this is a case where it goes awry. There is a treatment for sleep apnea, but many people don't like it. They have a ventilator they have to wear during sleep. And there is an effort to try and find a less invasive way of assuring that the airways stay open so you don't need these CPAP ventilators.
Have you come across anything that might be on the horizon in terms of an intervention for sleep apnea that might not be
There are
CPAP?
some drugs which are in phase 2 or phase 3 trials that seem to act. At one point we looked at the motor neurons controlling the muscles in the tongue that pull it forward. And the idea was that if we could activate those during sleep, then what would happen is you would pull the tongue forward, it would just stay away from the walls. And we tried to get a couple of the companies that make these special ventilators to support our research. And they basically said, oh, that's fine. We're selling $1 billion a year worth of ventilators. We don't want to cut into our own business. So we just dropped it.
Can you give us some insight as to why sleep apnea and episodic hypoxia throughout the night is actually detrimental to health? I think from our perspective, it's pretty logical and obvious. But for maybe other people that might not know, what do you think?
Well, several things are happening. One is your blood pressure goes way up.
Mm.
And when your blood pressure goes way up, you can have all sorts of vascular incidents of which the brain is not immune. So that's not good. You have episodes when you're not moving air in and out where the oxygen levels drop because particularly in the brain is constantly using oxygen. It doesn't care about whether you're breathing or not. It's constantly using oxygen. Now, if you stop breathing and you stop taking in oxygen, what happens is the oxygen levels in the brain start dropping. When that happens, all sorts of things begin to change with brain metabolism. The brain tissue doesn't like it. The neurons don't like it. The glia don't like it. And people who have persistent sleep apnea over a long period of time, there's loss of white matter. And it's just in general bad for the brain.
Yeah. Are you aware of how low someone's O2 sat will get in the middle of the night if they have untreated obstructive sleep apnea? I'm not aware of that. I don't know if you do.
I don't have the number off.
You don't know? Okay. Maybe something we can look up later. So another point that I thought was cool that I wanted to hit with you, you mentioned sort of this positional aspect of breathing. And certainly if you have obstructive sleep apnea, it gets worse when you lie, when you recline, and when you're horizontal. But I do wonder, like, from my perspective, I see a lot of spine patients and a lot of people with spine-related pain. And we know that low back pain is so prevalent because we were meant to crawl on all fours and now we're upright, right? I do wonder if there's an element of that in regards to how the lungs are positioned and how we walk upright versus on all fours. Is there anything to that from a breathing perspective or no?
It's interesting, but I don't have an answer. I mean, there's a lot we don't understand about sleep.
Yeah.
And, some people sleep on their back, others sleep, face down, others sleep sideways. In fact, one of the first treatments that might be recommended for someone who has sleep apnea, which is prevalent while on the back, is to sleep face down.
Oh, really?
Not the face in the mattress, but face to the side, because when you do that, the natural position of the tongue is to pull away from the back of the airways.
Right.
And apparently a lot of individuals have greatly reduced incidence of obstruction when they turn over.
Now, breathing's mostly automatic, right? But it's one of those funny things that actually helps us to understand, I think you've said in the past, consciousness. There's a bigger question here, or a bigger topic to cover. What does breathing tell us about human consciousness?
It's a good question. I don't always succeed in explaining that to my colleagues who tend to think of breathing as, it's just how the brain generates, it's like a pendulum. There's nothing to it.
Simple.
But if you wanted to learn the keys to English language, do you start by reading James Joyce or you read Dr. Seuss? My feeling is Dr. Seuss has all the basic elements. It has nouns, verbs, sentences, paragraphs. Vocabulary is simple. You go to something like James Joyce, I think most people who are fluent in English don't even understand that. I mean, it may be the epitome of how exquisite the English language would be, but to me, that's analogous of a lot of these higher functions. You talk about consciousness, speech. They're all extraordinarily complex things. And moreover, because many of these things are not readily manifest in non-human vertebrates, how do you study them? Because we're very limited in what we can investigate in humans. Right. Whereas rats and mice breathe. The breathing is in detail somewhat different, but the basic mechanisms are the same. They have to generate a rhythmic breathing pattern. They have to breathe continuously. And it turns out we were able to identify in rodents, initially rats, this site, which is the engine for generating breathing, which we named the prebutzinger complex. And I can talk to you about how we named it.
Yeah.
But and it turns out that we found it in rodents, then people who had data in humans were able to look in that region, equivalent region in the human brain, and find that in fact there is a place that now is designated as the human prebutsular complex, where the rhythm is breathing is being generated. So had we not been able to do the experiments in other animals, now talking about, let's say, speech and language, I can maybe do MRIs at a very coarse level that, neurons are behaving in a millisecond level. They're interacting individually, hundreds of thousands of neurons at a time. And we can't get that. We can't do that in humans. We can do that in rodents. We can do experiments under the ethical conditions that we now have for regulating the experiments in rodents, and directly investigate at a level where we can get to the actual underlying mechanism in terms of what the nervous system is doing. Then once we have that, we can then design experiments about breathing. Now, you then ask the question, but that's just about breathing. What does that have to do with anything else?
Yeah.
Well, you saw my analogy of the watch, how complicated that is. So here we have something which is extremely complicated, but we think we can pull it apart. And we've been chasing after the mechanism by which the breathing rhythm is generated. And we started out thinking it's very simple, that it was basically that we had neurons that behave very much like the pacemaker cells in the heart, that individual cells generated the rhythm because they had particular membrane channels called conductances that had special properties, and they would oscillate. That solved the problem. We tested that, didn't work. It's not pacemaker neurons. So then we went after another idea. The other idea was that we had two populations of neurons, one that was excitatory and one that was inhibitory. The excitatory neurons would get activated and increase their activity, excite the inhibitory neurons. The inhibitory neurons would have a high threshold of activation, but once I activated them, they would come back and turn that excitatory cells off. And back at zero, we start over again. That doesn't work. We did the experiment where we blocked inhibition in the circuits that involved in generating breathing in rats. They still continue to breathe quite fine. So we don't need inhibition. So, when all those fails, you start thinking of crazy ideas. And so we had this observation when that the key elements in the brain about breathing were reflected in the motor output. So, and the most important motor output is for the diaphragm for inspiration. And that's silence, burst of activity, termination of activity, silence. So we thought what we had to do was find cells in the brain that did that. And that would be the key for rhythm generation. Well, we found that. But then when we recorded in this region, prebutsular complex, we saw that even though the burst in the diaphragm was not preceded by any activity, in the prebutsular complex, there was like a low-level run-up of activity just before, and then all of a sudden a burst would occur. We didn't see this in the output, but we saw this in the prebutsular complex. So we pursued this, and it turns out that this low-level activity is actually the mechanism for generating the rhythm. We can get rid of the ability to generate bursts, and we still get this low-level rhythm. So then the question is, how does that rhythm get generated? And late at night, in the lab, after an experiment, we said, how can you increase the activity in a population of neurons without any one of them having one of these pacemaker properties? And we came up with this crazy idea. It's synchronization. That is, imagine you have several inputs to a neuron. And those inputs are firing randomly and are not synchronized. And each of those inputs is rather small. So because they're small, they don't cause the neuron they're targeting to become active, because that neuron needs a certain level of activation. It's below threshold. But if I take those input neurons and suddenly, instead of making them fire more often, suddenly make them fire closer together, what happens is those signals add up on top of each other, and they get activity. So we said, the key is synchronization. It turns out it is, or that's our speculation. And I have something on the other. Okay, can you play the video here? Okay, so watch this. So they're going to start randomly. Okay, they're totally unsynchronized. Okay, now they're sitting on this platform that loosely couples them. Now watch what happens. To me, that's amazing.
Incredible. What is that? What's the underlying physics
So
of that?
it turns out in the physical world and the biological world, this is a very common phenomenon, that things that oscillate, that are loosely coupled, tend to synchronize. So there was a report of women in dormitories synchronize their monthly cycle.
It's the same thing with nurses. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah, where nurses on one floor in the hospital will all like get pregnant at the same time.
Well, I don't know about pregnancy. This is their monthly cycle.
No,
So
I mean, maybe that implies similar menstrual cycles. I don't know.
well,
but
we
whatever.
could probably say something that's not safe for a podcast, but
This is a
so-
safe space. You can say anything you want. right.
it's going out to the world.
Okay.
Okay. So I could say it to you off the record. To me, my favorite example is fireflies. This is well studied. So if you go and you watch fireflies at dusk, you see that they're firing randomly. But what will happen after a while is they start synchronizing. Now, how does that happen? They're not communicating directly with each other, but when a firefly has a burst of light, it's visual signal picked up by the other fireflies, and that apparently acts as a synchronization signal. Here, the synchronization for those metronomes was on a platform that was on 2 beer cans, and so the oscillations were communicated through that platform, and eventually, because of the timing, it would delay the timing or accelerate the timing of any of the oscillations till they got all in sync, and then that system was perfectly happy.
But what you're saying is that secondary to it having a balance on those 2 cans, or this is just like a simple phenomenon that
Well,
just
they have to be
occurs in
loosely
nature?
coupled.
If you put it on a flat table, they
Yeah.
will not synchronize.
They will not synchronize.
They will not
Okay.
synchronize.
There
So-
has to be some sensing mechanism between the
exactly.
metronomes or cells or fireflies, so it can sense one oscillator, one rate to the next, and eventually, nature has it, as in Stephen Strogat's book Sync, that they just synchronize.
There you
They
go.
come together.
Okay.
It's this wild phenomenon.
Yeah.
And so what we think is happening is that after each burst of activity, there's a thousand, up to a few thousand neurons start firing at very low levels randomly. But they're in an interconnected network. And if the firing rates are in a sweet spot and the connections are in the sweet spot and the synaptic connectivity is in a sweet spot, they always synchronize. And if you have enough neurons, this is one of the things that my colleagues have a hard time wrapping their heads around. How can it be so reliable? They get it can oscillate, but damn it, you're doing it a billion times in your lifetime.
Right.
Well, it's just a matter of numbers. You can't, if you have 5 neurons, it's not going to happen. If you have 1,000, it'll happen every time. And the thing is, it'll happen every time at about the same duration, but not exactly the same. So this can explain the variance you get from one breath cycle to the next.
Yeah.
So what happens when they synchronize? Zoom back out. So they're oscillating or firing, and then eventually they synchronize.
Okay, and as they synchronize, the activity starts increasing, and then it feeds on itself through positive feedback. And it goes from that low level, it reaches a trigger point, and then you get an explosion.
And
breath.
that's
the
an
burst.
inhale?
That's a breath.
That's the inhale,
Oh,
correct.
cool.
Yeah. So we initially observed this in a highly reduced experimental preparation, but we recently now have verification in mice that we see this happening.
Yeah.
So it still remains to be more rigorously tested, but it's probably the best working hypothesis now. And the thing I love about it, it's not obvious.
Yeah.
We had to go through all this wandering through all the obvious choices to to wind at that. I mean, it's like we were like the drunks looking under the lamppost. That's where the light was.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And then when we didn't find it, we had to go in the bushes.
Can we just reflect on that a little bit more? Because it made an impression on me just now. The fact of how the essential breathing mechanism to humans somehow reflects nature in general. Like you mentioned the firefly thing, and certainly probably other kind of this phenomenon in nature of synchronization.
Well, I think it happens. The brain did not create the substrate for synchronization occurring from loosely coupled oscillators. What the brain seemed to do with breathing is it had these loosely coupled oscillators, which are neurons, and found out, and I use that term with some reluctance because I don't want to anthropomorphize this, but evolved that it could produce something extremely reliable in mammals. And the ability of our brains to become big brains that need continuous oxygen was critically dependent on the evolution of the diaphragm. If you look at amphibians and reptiles, they don't have a diaphragm. They breathe by contracting their rib cage, so they actively exhale and passively inhale. Exhale, inhale.
Mm-hmm.
Now, their brains are pretty small. They're cold-blooded because they can't have lungs that have large enough surface area. The surface area to volume in their lungs is pretty modest.
Mm-hmm.
You start out with one airway here, it branches. The airways may branch 7 or 8 times.
Mm-hmm.
Human airways branch 22, 23 times.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
You have 400 to 500 million alveoli, these air sacs.
Mm-hmm.
And even though each one is tiny, 100 microns across, with 500 million of them, there's 70 square meters of surface area. It's about a third the size of a tennis court.
Mm-hmm.
So can you imagine the muscle power you need to expand a membrane that's 70 square meters? You're doing that all the time. It doesn't look like you're working very hard because your diaphragm is a pretty amazing muscle.
Yeah.
But before the diaphragm appeared, vertebrates were restricted to very limited amounts of air that they can move, limited amounts of oxygen, so they couldn't support constant warm blood temperatures, and they couldn't guarantee that the brain would always have a constant supply of oxygen.
Mm-hmm.
Diaphragm appears, suddenly you can now begin to evolve big brains that are ravenous for their use of oxygen, and here we are. So you could say that the road to being a human came through the diaphragm.
Mm-hmm.
I assure you, he's working harder than me to breathe. But
You're the one with the heart rate up.
I know. It's just that 10 extra years. So the thing that's so interesting to me, and I think it's hard to grasp, so I want to zoom in again, is that this tiny little cluster of cells, would you say 2,000-3,000 that synchronize, but there's like a 5,000 cell cluster in your brainstem, are firing off at rates that are not synchronous, eventually synchronize and trigger an inhale, right? And that has to happen for every inhale. That's unbelievable to me that all of it is wired down to that tiny little cluster. Yet we're doing it 5 billion times,
But that
or
it's
a billion
also,
times a
but
lifetime.
that it's also related to this like phenomenon of synchronization
Yeah,
that
right.
that we not only see in ourselves, but we see in everything
Outside
around us.
ourselves, yeah.
So as my pal Cliff Saber, who's a renowned neuroscientist, the neurologist at Harvard, says the rat doesn't lie. So get used to it.
Yeah.
Our hypothesis could be wrong.
Sure,
Sure.
sure.
There are lots of things we discovered about the world that were not obvious until after the fact.
Yeah.
You know about Schopenhauer's 3 stages of truth?
No,
I never remember them. I have to.
I'm going to look it up. Don't worry about it. Schopenhauer.
Schopenhagen or Schopenhauer?
Schopenhauer. All right. Let's go in and see if we can find it fast.
First, it's ridiculed.
Oh, yeah.
Then
Sure.
it's violently opposed. And finally, it's accepted as self-evident.
Yeah.
Yeah?
So, we're in a stage where a lot of things we say is self-evident about the world, but it's not always self-evident.
Right.
Yeah.
And I actually, went through that process when we identified the pre-Butzinger complex. No one wanted to believe it.
Hmm.
They thought the rhythm was coming from somewhere else. And
What was the mainstream at the time? Where was the rhythm coming
It
from?
was a region that was a different part of the brainstem, but was based on a premise which now is almost laughable. An investigator could not find any other place where the rhythm was generated, and he saw that there was this rhythm in this other region. So he says, by process of elimination, he took absence of evidence as evidence of absence.
Wow.
So we did an experiment showing that he was wrong, that there was respiratory activity elsewhere. And then we wound up doing a series of experiments where we identified this region. And most of my colleagues had so much vested in this other region being involved that, that's the way science works. Your mortgage and your claim to glory is dependent on believing a certain set of beliefs.
Yeah.
And when they get overturned, you resist. Max Planck, the famous physicist, said the only way old ideas die is when the physicists who believe in them die. And you laugh at that, but I mean, what happened was over a period of about 10 years, we did experiments, but also what happened is a lot of people who opposed it just sort of either got out of the business or circled around and said, oh, in my old paper, I actually had discovered that before you did.
Right.
I mean, it
Out
was,
of the woodwork.
it was
Classic.
amazing. We don't have a patent on ideas.
Right.
But I want to get back to a question you asked earlier, which, and that is, what might this tell us about what's going on in the brain?
Oh, yeah.
And I think the notion of synchronization is one that was originally came to my attention from people working on cortex, because what they felt was in the cortex, that's this outer part of the brain where we associate many of the higher functions, that many things that were happening when neurons would suddenly synchronize.
Yeah.
And the challenge there is tying that synchronization to behavior. And we're now in the process of tying synchronization to a very readily measurable behavior. Whereas in a rodent or human, it's hard to characterize a lot of the, what's a behavior?
Yeah, right.
We talk about fear. What is fear? Well, now if we study it in mice, we don't measure fear. They can't give us an internal reading of fear. We measure freezing, that they freeze, which we associate with fear. But that's a surrogate of fear. It's not, to me, the essence of fear. Whereas breathing, I can give you every relevant variable, and I could tie that to what I see in the brain, and ultimately I can sift through and see what's causal and what's extraneous.
Yeah. So that satisfied your early interest to pick some topic that would teach you about how the brain works.
Yeah, now I'm still in the process of convincing my colleagues to pay attention.
That breathing is that interesting.
My colleagues who work on higher function.
Yes. So this little cluster of cells synchronizes, causes an inhale, and then sometimes you can override that and inhale yourself, because breathing is one of these things. My question about consciousness comes from the fact that breathing is one of these things that you can automatically do and most of the time do that, but then sometimes consciously control.
Absolutely. Well, this is topic for another discussion about what you mean by consciously control.
Okay, all right.
It's
voluntarily controlled.
Volitional control.
Yes.
Whether it involves consciousness or not, if I pinch you or startle you, your breathing will change.
Yes.
And it doesn't necessarily require anything that's conscious. So there's lots of inputs to that system. But, it has sort of a baseline mode, and the baseline mode works until you need to intervene. But even when you intervene, so we're sitting here talking, and we're controlling our expiratory airflow, but we pause. We don't notice the pauses, but we're pausing all the time because we have to inhale. Otherwise, unless you're a renowned opera singer and do an aria where you have to have a note for an extended period of time, we're inhaling every couple of seconds while we're speaking.
It's incredible. The override, where does that override signal come from? Is that also pre-Butzinger, or is there somewhere else?
We think that everything through pre-Butzinger. So we did an experiment where we ablated neurons in pre-Butzinger. And it took several days for the way we ablated them to occur. And then the mice could no longer generate a normal breathing pattern. Then we found a way to inhibit the prebutsular complex like this. What would happen is in awake rats, they would stop breathing. And when we originally thought of the experiment, we said, okay, their automatic pattern of breathing is turned off. They'll just volitionally breathe. Didn't happen. They turned blue, and you
So
could.
the automatic did turn off.
The automatic did turn off. They turned blue. They looked like they were getting into distress,
Right.
and we had to mechanically ventilate them. And then the technique we used wore off after several minutes, and then they were able to breathe fine. But their ability to volitionally change their breathing or change their breathing in response to realizing that there was no airflow was gone.
So they couldn't do a gasp or some agonal breath
No,
to
nothing.
revive themselves.
Nothing.
Wow.
Yeah.
So whatever higher order center's sending the message down that a breath should happen, overriding this kind of regular breathing pattern has to go through.
That's our current, I think, understanding. But it's not just the breath. Hold your breath.
Yeah.
We have an interesting theory about breath holding.
Okay.
Can I just spew it out?
Yes,
we're
go
just.
for it.
I hope you don't mind me meandering
it's
around.
totally fine.
So, we originally thought the prebutsular complex generated both cycles of breathing, both inspiration and expiration. And the notion is that a single oscillator could do multiple phases. So we have day and night on the Earth, but it's one oscillator. We just go round and round, we get day and night. So we thought that the prebutsular complex did both. But it turns out we did an experiment where we saw that we made a certain manipulation. The rats stopped inspiring, but continued to expire rhythmically. So it began to breathe like an amphibian. It went, no inspiratory efforts. So we said, my goodness, maybe there's another oscillator. Long story short, we found the second oscillator. That second oscillator, not far away in the brainstem, is involved in what we now call active expiration. It turns out that for normal resting breathing, expiration is a passive process. You inhale and you relax, like pulling on a spring and letting go. And so this other structure is normally kept silent. You don't need it, which is probably why we never found it. It's only when we did these things to force expiratory movements that we found it. And so we did this incredible experiment where we had a rat breathing normally with no expiratory activity. We were able to excite this other expiratory oscillator, and the animal started to go inspiration, expiration, inspiration, expiration. So what we think happens, and this is what the data suggests, is that normally we keep this turned off. When we have to increase our ventilation, we initially do it by breathing deeper and a little bit faster, no expiration. But at some point, that's not efficient in moving more air. We need to begin to actively expire. That turns on this second oscillator. So we have two oscillators. Now, it turns out that a colleague who was a pediatric neurologist working with kids who have CCHS, central congenital hyperventilation syndrome, used to be called Undine's curse. These are kids who basically forget to breathe.
Hypoventilation.
So it's at birth.
Wow.
And she did a genetic study and found there was a mutation in a gene called FOX2B, PHOX2B gene. And it's a mutation where this particular triplet gets repeated too many times. And it's a CAG repeat. If it's repeated 30 times or more, kids are symptomatic. Associated with the FOX2B gene. So then another colleague looked in the brain where the FOX2B gene was expressed. Now, the FOX2B gene is an old gene. It's found in sponges, so it's been around forever. And she found it was concentrated in this region where we found the expiratory oscillator. And that region also has cells which are sensitive to carbon dioxide. So it's two things are going on in that region. My pediatric neurologist colleague, Debbie Wiesmeyer, was watching a documentary about free divers. These are people who go to great depths, hold their breath for a long, long time. And she said, my goodness, they look like my kids. It turns out that kids who have CCHS not only did have this breathing problem, but they have a mild facial anomaly, which I might not notice. You as trained neurologists may notice, but I didn't notice. But when she pointed out to me, you notice it. And she saw some of the free divers had this anomaly.
Wow.
The idea sat there for 15 years. And then last year I was at a meeting and I ran into a physiologist who studies free divers. And I said, let's do the experiment. So we now have an experiment where we're going to look at the genes expressed in free divers, just take a cheek swab. And our prediction is that some fraction of these individuals will be, so they don't have CCHS.
Right.
But the idea is that
so they may have some repeats.
Right. Instead of having 30 repeats, they may have 25 repeats.
Wow.
So they're able to hold their breath for a long time. By the way, kids with CCHS can hold their breath till they pass out. So the idea being the reason they can hold their breath is not because they have more willpower. It just doesn't bother them. So we're doing the experiment.
It's incredible.
So I think it's really, it's really cool. It totally came out of nowhere, and it was just the stars aligned that happened to pump into the sky, and he got excited by it, and we're now.
What about the physiologic psi? How does that play into this whole thing? What's the area involved? What's the function?
So I think most people, particularly before we published this big paper, considered sighing to be an emotional expression. You're happy, you're sad, you sigh. Us physiology nerds knew that you needed to sigh to maintain lung health. So you have these tiny, tiny little air sacs, they're little spheres that are fluid lined. And what happens when a balloon that has fluid on the inside, when the edges stick together, they stick together because of surface tension. Well, it turns out your alveoli have a very, very small probability of collapsing, but they collapse all the time. And so what happens when an alveolus collapses, no gas exchange can occur there. The blood vessels going by don't pick up any oxygen, and basically you lose that part of the lung. Now, a normal breath is not enough to pop it open. Just as if you took a balloon, made a wet on the inside, and with the sides sticking together, try and blow it up. A normal breath is not going to do it. You're going to really have to pound the air in there. And what happened will go, pop open. How do you pop open the alveoli? A sigh. What's a sigh? It's a deep breath. You sigh about every 5 minutes. You don't notice it. It's funny because before we published the paper, I would constantly ask both scientists and non-scientists about this, and people were all over the place. 5 times a day, 100 times an hour. It was just all over the place. People had no idea. And a lot of people were shocked by the fact I said you sigh every 5 minutes. They didn't believe it. They didn't think it happened that often. And I said, just lie down in a quiet room and pay attention to your breathing. You'll notice every couple of minutes you're taking a deep breath. And you need to take that deep breath because you need to pop open those alveoli. If I prevented you from sighing, what would happen is more and more of your lung would become non-functional, and ultimately you could die. This was the experience with the use of iron lungs in the treatment of people with polio. They couldn't generate sufficient force to have a normal inspiration, so they would put them in these cylinders, generate a negative pressure outside the body, and that would cause the chest wall to expand, the lung would expand. when they used it with normal lung volumes, they had very high mortality rates. Didn't understand why, but what they did was they just made larger lung volume inflations. In the 50s, they realized that they didn't have to just use larger volumes. They just had to have a big breath every once in a while. And if you look at individuals in the hospital being ventilated, you see the ventilator goes every once in a while, will go up. That's that thing to pop open the alveoli. And so we, working with colleagues at Stanford, we investigated this. I think I might have told you this story last time, but no one is going to go back and listen to the last one, so I'll tell it again. One of the guys in my lab was reading about stress. And during stress, you sigh more. And during stress, you release these peptides from your hypothalamus called bombesin-related peptides.
Oh, yeah, sure.
So we thought, you remember, and we thought they might be related. So we bought some bombesin, which was cheap. We injected it in pre-Butzinger in rats. They went from sighing 25 times an hour to 500 per hour without changing their baseline breathing frequency.
Wow.
We weren't too interested in the sigh. We let the data sit on the shelf. I had, in parallel, gotten a phone call from a MD PhD student at Stanford who asked me all these questions about breathing. And I asked him, you're in a lab of a biochemist who studies the lungs of Drosophila. Why are you asking me questions? And he said, well, when I was an undergraduate at UCLA, I went to one of your classes and you gave a lecture on breathing. And you wanted to figure it out. So I became sort of a distant mentor of him. About a year and a half later, I'm up at Stanford to give grand rounds in neurology. And I go to speak to these guys. And so I went to speak to the graduate student and his advisor. And at the end of the conversation, the advisor says, we recently identified a unique molecule in regions of the brainstem that may be important for breathing. And I said, can you share that with me? He says, no, we want to work on it. And that's not the way I'd like to do science, but in fact, a lot of science gets done that way, particularly amongst biochemists. If you have the sequence of something interesting, if someone else knows what that sequence is, they can do your experiment tomorrow because they can just make that molecule tomorrow. So until you've done your experiments with your molecule, you don't publicize it. So he didn't want to tell me. So as I'm walking out of his office, I have to catch my flight back to LA. I realized there was only one molecule that was unusual we were working with, bombesin. So as I'm walking out the door, I said, is this related to bombesin? He didn't wait for an answer. I just rushed out because I had to catch my plane. My phone starts ringing. And it's the professor, Mark Krasnow, calls me and says, Jack, the molecule we found is one of the bombesin-related peptides. And he said, well, that's very interesting. And then he says to me, what does it do? And I said, I'm not telling. So that was my sweet revenge. And of course, we wound up doing experiments and we got this big paper out of this and it went viral. It was pretty amazing journey. So we work out this small circuit where you have cells containing these peptides outside pre-Butzinger near this region where the expiratory oscillator is, projecting to pre-Butzinger. And they seem to produce a steady trickle of this peptide. These peptides. If you block the peptides, the animal stops sighing. So we know those peptides can play a critical role. So we think what happens is under circumstances where the hypothalamus is releasing those peptides, that's when you begin to sigh more. And so it's all tied into an explanation as to how you get these emotive sighs. And I think that now ties in to the fact that sighs not only seem to inflate the lung, but they seem to calm you down. And why is that? Well, the question is, I asked a different question, is why did that happen? Why should a deep breath calm you down? And so here's a just so story. You're a small prey. You have to hide from a predator. So you're in the bushes somewhere. You're scared. Your heart's beating. You're breathing fast. You're going to be pretty detectable. If you sigh and that calms you down, you're going to breathe slower. You may be less detectable. And to the degree that gives some survivability advantage, animals that sighed and were calm would have a greater likelihood of having progeny. And so this is now turning the arrow around that the sighing itself can be calming. And we all know from our own experience that a single breath can be calming. You're nervous, you're going to give a lecture, you're going to be on the first tee of a golf course. You're nervous.
I'm going to need way more than just a sigh.
Well,
That's for sure.
take 2 or 3 breaths.
But what's the difference between a breath and a sigh then?
Okay, so to us, a sigh is, if a normal breath is 500 cc's, 500 milliliters, a sigh would be 2 or 3 times bigger. And it can look like one continuous large breath, or it can look like a normal inspiration starting to terminate, and then another inspiration on top of that. So inhale, I think Human likes to call them double inhales. It's basically a form of sigh.
Right.
And so we think the effect is, first of all, in inflating the lung, it's going to be dependent on that large lung volume. And so it doesn't matter whether it's one continuous or 2 on top of each other. And I think the effect in being calming is also related to the volume. And I think once then this sighs are calming, the brain then began to hijack breathing for the ability to signal. So we have lots of oscillation that are important in our brain. We have delta waves, gamma waves. They have all sorts of Greek letters associated with them over a broad range of frequencies. And neuroscientists have known for a long time that these oscillations play a role in signaling in the brain. That if you take them away, signaling changes. So they're there for a purpose. They're not epiphenomenal. About 10, 15 years ago, people began to realize that breathing-related oscillations, which you see in the brain, were playing a role in signal processing in the brain. And when you take them away, you change the signal processing in the brain. And so we think that this now ties in to the fact that when you change your breathing pattern, so your volitional signal is changing your breathing pattern, it goes back now to calm you down. And I have, I think, a slide which sort of goes over what the mechanisms could be by which this is happening.
This one?
No, next one, or the previous one. No, next one.
That one?
Yeah, okay. So here we have the pre-Butzinger complex, which is where the breathing rhythm is generated. Now, the pre-Butzinger complex, so go ahead and click once, has ties to emotions. So we found projections from the pre-Butzinger complex to regions of the brain that are associated with emotions. So we have that projection. We also have 2 regions in the pons, which is part of the brainstem, the locus coeruleus, LC, and the parabrachial nucleus. We have projections from pre-Butzinger, and those regions also seem to be important in modulating emotional states. So we have projections from their emotional state. Okay. We also have breathing-related oscillations in smelling, olfaction. So we inhale with the respiratory cycle, and so odors are coming in periodically. In fact, aromatherapy may be not the aroma, but the fact is that you're putting a signal that's respiratory modulated in the brain at a particular higher intensity because you're stimulating a subset of receptors. You also have vagus nerve, because the pulmonary stretch receptors in the lung are being activated with every breath. That's another pathway coming in.
Can I interrupt you real quick?
Of course.
Is that why volume might be related to?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And we know that in certain forms of depression that are refractory to many kinds of treatment.
Yes.
Stimulation of the vagus nerve can be antidepressant,
Oh,
can be effective. So that signals coming into the vagus can calm you down,
Mm-hmm.
quite plausible. Then oxygen and CO2 can also have an effect. There are forms of breathing practice which can markedly change the CO2 levels. You know, Wim Hof has very high levels of ventilation, so your CO2 levels are going to drop, your pH is going to go up. That in and of itself can have an effect. And then he has extended periods of apnea, no breathing, which is going to lower your CO2. So the blood gases can have an effect. And then, of course, you have volitional signals, which can, as we discussed earlier, can go down through pre-Butzinger, but also can directly impact emotion. And so we have all these ways of trying to figure out what the mechanism is. So the question is, how can we study it? So we asked ourselves the question, can we get mice to meditate? You laugh. People laughed. You know, you can't do anything interesting if you're afraid of failing. And we fail all the time. But occasionally we have successes. And it's like venture capitalism. Every investment doesn't have to work. But if you have a Google every now and then, you do just fine.
Are these mice also doing yoga or just meditating?
Well, breath work. They're doing breath work.
We've got Annie Hoffman in our bigger brain sport group, and she said, give her a call out.
All right, great. All right, so here's an experiment. We have awake adult mice, and we put a special molecule into pre-Butzinger complex that, if we shine a light, will excite the inhibitory neurons. Okay? Or we can put this is a special virus, or we can put a virus in that doesn't have that special molecule. So our control mice is we put a molecule in that doesn't respond to light. And what we do is if we trigger, so we superimpose lots of cycles.
Jack, can I interrupt you? You can grab the mic and then, yep.
Boy, I have to give
Yeah.
you this. This is
You
like
got
my
showed
daily
off, those arms.
resistance training. This is many breaths superimposed, and we just triggered on like the peak of inspiration to see whether or not there would be any changes following any given breath. You don't see any changes. And okay, and if we look at these mice in a fear test, which is freezing, they're all over the place, but this is what you see normally. In other words, they freeze about 40% of the time. And now we take our control mice, and so next one. Next to our test mice, and now we put this special molecule that responds to light. We turn on the inhibitory neurons. And when we do that, we prevent the next inspiration. So the mouse is awake, but when we turn the light on at the peak of end of inspiration, it has a longer expiratory period. So we're slowing the breathing down.
Okay.
It's almost like box breathing or something. A longer
but it's
expiratory
it's
phase.
not volitional. Okay, we haven't figured out to get the mice to listen to us. Okay, but it avoids the placebo effect.
Right,
no placebo, because the mice
have no expectations.
Exactly.
So you're prolonging expiration and also inspiration as well?
No, we don't care about inspiration. All we want to do is slow the breathing pattern.
Okay.
You have to understand, we wanted a way to change the breathing pattern reliably.
Right.
We had no idea whether we get any changes in behavior.
Right.
It took 3 years to figure out this protocol.
Right. Okay.
Okay. Then the question is, does it change their behavior? So we're working with Michael Fanslow and Annie Hoffman. Michael's like the world's expert on rodent fear. And he has all these protocols. So here he did the one in control mice. When we did the test mice, there was a remarkable reduction in their fearfulness, which you can see here. And this was at a very significant level. And according to Michael, given the normal dispersion, as you can see on the left here, that's quite a powerful effect here. So what we're doing is when we're slowing the breathing down in these mice, they're much calmer. This means a couple of things. I think I might have it down at the bottom here. All right. Okay. So slow breathing, it's not a placebo effect because it's in mice, and it's a platform to study mechanisms. So now we can do things in mice we can't do in people.
Right.
And we have parallel experiments that we're trying to design with Helen Lavretsky in psychiatry. So Helen's an interesting person. She's a psychiatrist who used breath practice for treating her patients who have high levels of anxiety. How did she find me? When we published a paper on projections to locus coeruleus that went viral, was published in Science, went viral. She doesn't read science, but she reads the New York Times. So the New York Times wrote about it, and she sees my name in the article and calls me up. She's maybe 100 yards from my office. We never met, and this is about 7, 8 years ago. We've been working ever since, trying to get some center for studying breathing and emotion, brain health, and whatnot. So, and it's very interesting because for me, trying to get the data in humans is always a challenge, and trying to understand the mechanism in humans is the real challenge. And ultimately, you want to be able to improve human health.
Right.
So working this way is great.
So my sense is break this down further for not only myself, who might not be as scientific as the two geniuses sitting at the table right now, but rather maybe like some our other audience members, like, all right, fear decreases as we slow our breathing pattern. Are there specific breathing patterns that replicate what we're seeing here in the mice model? Is it before the stressor? Is it during? Is it also after? Can you help us out a little bit?
Well, great questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, I'm late to the game here.
Okay.
This is, I don't do any human work, so I have to, issue those disclaimers. There's a lot of studies in humans that are not very reliable. They're what we call underpowered. That is, they don't have enough data to make a strong conclusion. They're poorly controlled. That is, they don't have a way of separating what they do from just being a random effect or placebo. If I do a breathing study on subjects, they're going to come in there knowing breathing is supposed to make them calmer, even if I have a control. So what's the control? Well, it's hard. Oh, you play music. Well, what kind of music do you play? You play calming music. Well, they're going to slow their breathing down during calming music. Or you play cacophonous music. That's going to stress them in a different way. So it's hard to come up with a good control. So the HHP Foundation, which is run by Tanya Bentley, who's also a neuroscientist, looked at like 3,000 papers on breath work in humans. And they only found about 80 of them to be sufficiently well powered with good controls. And they came to the conclusion that 5 minutes a day of plain breath work, box breathing, 4-7-8, something very simple you can do with an app without any instruction, had for 30 days could produce measurable improvement in physiological and emotional variables. Okay, now, then you ask the question, well, is it breathing patterns specific for the breath work? And I'll go back to the idea of exercise. Someone's a couch potato, people haven't done breath work, don't give them something exotic. Have them do something simple like box breathing. Box breathing, inhale, hold, exhale, hold. Typically 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds, 4 seconds. There are hundreds of free apps you can do this. It's very easy to do. Most people find it not stressful. And, do it for, 30 days and see whether or not you feel any different. So a couch potato, don't run a marathon, walk around the block, walk around the playground twice, 3 times. When you do that, then maybe you can begin to jog. You might get to a point then you say, okay, I'm getting this exercise thing. I want to improve my strength, or I want to increase my endurance. I want to increase my speed. Depending on which one of those you choose, there may be likely be a different exercise regimen that's going to optimize that. And so my feeling is, depending on what your goals are with breath work, are you depressed and want to relieve depression? Are you anxious? You want to relieve anxiety? Do you just want to just chill? You may find that different breathing patterns may resonate better with what your goals are. I know there are lots of gurus out there now who make claims that particular breathing patterns have particular effects. I think the data is not to the level that as a scientist I would say they're rock solid. But, look, if it works for you, who cares?
Cost is very low.
Yeah. Well, some of these gurus charge money. Okay?
Fair enough. The guided ones, yeah, but just breathing practice in general.
Yeah. So,
But the interesting thing about the conclusion from the systematic review of 5 minutes a day, 30 days, is that the rat study, I think one of the things that got lost was it was 30 minutes a day for 4 weeks. And then they were put in this fear exposure scenario where they showed less of a fear response or a freezing response. So there was something that happened, right?
well, that's actually a very important point. In other words, we did not study their behavior while we were changing their breathing, which is certainly legitimate to study. But we wanted to see what the long-term effects were. In fact, we had a 3-day rest period after the breath training before we did the testing. So we made sure there was not just some short-term lingering effect after the last session of breath training. So that big break was important. And as you, I think, agree with our interpretation, that it's a significant, long-lasting effect.
It's fascinating.
Now, we didn't test it out over a period of time to see if it waned. You have to understand, when we did this study, we had no idea whether it was going to work or not. When we looked at the data, it was like it just knocked us out of the chair.
Yeah.
I mean, because we were blind to the data. The people doing the experiments were blind to what was a control and what was a test mouse. In fact, after we did the study, we did it again with a different group of experimenters to try and reduce as possible that there be any experimenter bias, that the experimenters may have manipulated the two populations differently, even though there should have been no overt indication of which group the animals belong to. And here again, we were tremendously relieved when the data fell exactly on top of the original data.
I mean, and you got to wonder what's the rest of the physiological correlate to that to kind of paint the picture. Did the cardiovascular system change? Is there some slowed heart rate or sympathetic response that changed the fear response?
It's all in our
freezing
list of
response.
the only limitation is the experiments take time.
Yeah.
Okay, you make an injection. It takes about 6 weeks for the molecule to get expressed.
Wow.
Then you have to implant a fiber into the brainstem, which is tricky. Then you have to train the animals, 30 days, and then you have to test the animals. Then you have to analyze the data, and we also have to verify that the injections were in the right place. In fact, one of the controls we have for being that it's an effect in pre-Butzinger were injections that just missed the pre-Butzinger. So we were there. Do we get the same effect? Turns out you don't.
Oh, wow.
So it suggests the site specificity was real.
Yeah.
So it's time consuming. What we're hoping, we have this paper now in bioRxiv, that people who are interested in it can now replicate our technique and study whatever they want.
Yeah. And then in the human translation, slow breathing and see what happens with training.
Well, we actually have penciled in experiments in humans. So, for example, if it's olfactory, we have people who are anosmic.
Yeah.
They can't detect odor. Does breath work for them? No idea. They could do that experiment. We have people with heart-lung transplants or just lung transplants. They have no pulmonary vagus.
So disconnected completely from the autonomic nervous system.
Not autonomic nervous system. I mean, when the lung gets taken out, they cut the vagus nerve going to the lung, so they're not getting the rhythmic activity from lung expansion.
Yeah.
That's when the signals we postulate could be involved.
Affecting emotion.
Now we have human beings who don't have that. Do we see an effect?
Fascinating.
We don't have bias. I mean, but there's always a challenge of doing experiments in these subjects.
What have you seen in terms of the differences between nasal and mouth breathing? That's a big topic, especially people are mouth taping at night, right? So that they can exclusively nasally breathe at night. What do you think?
Okay, so the mouth taping at night probably is to get better mechanics to keep the airways open. It probably has little to do with the breath work effects of breathing through the nose and breathing through the mouth. I would say originally I was agnostic about it because the literature I read showed that if you knocked out olfactory receptors, you still got a significant response. So there's a large cohort of very good scientists who believe a significant fraction, if not all, of the effective breath work is olfactory.
Wow.
But there's data that when you knock out olfaction, it's coming from pre-Butzinger. Okay, but there's not a large cohort of people doing that study because it's very easy to knock out the olfactory system. It's much harder to tinker with the pre-Butzinger. But I think if you look at olfactory inputs to the brain, they're very widespread and fairly powerful. And so the notion that they could be playing an important role in breath work since they're respiratory modulated is quite high. And when you breathe through the mouth and limit the breathing through the nose, then you're not getting the same signals. And as far as I know, the signals coming in from the receptors in the mouth, back of the airways, are not as powerful as the olfactory receptors. So I think there's a lot to be said for olfactory breathing being an important component of breath work. And, if you look at a lot of the meditative practices, they emphasize breathing through the nose, maybe exhaling through the mouth, and left nostril, right nostril. That I get the asymmetry in the brain, and it could play a role. I have not seen the killer date on that, but it's very possible.
Once it gets up into the sinus and hits the ethmoid, where the olfactory bulb then picks up whatever stimulation is going on, isn't it confluent? Or is the septum really completely separating those two nostrils?
I think the experiment is to block one nostril, see if you have an effect, then block the other nostril.
Sure.
The notion, the interpretation you have is the one that I sort of said, it all gets into mix. So how can it have an left, right, how can it have an effect? But maybe.
Yeah. I've got a potential postdoc who is looking to move out here to LA, who developed a probe that goes up through the nose all the way up to the ethmoid and sits right underneath the olfactory bulb. And it can stimulate electrically, it can stimulate in kind of a theoretical version that he's building now with ultrasound.
Oh, cool.
And can sense, and so kind of take a read from, whereas EEG and other devices that sit outside the brain or outside the skull can't really get the deeper structures data. They can't get this, inputs, at least in humans, from, unless you go invasively.
So what are you going to tie that data to?
Well, so the interesting thing is if you could create a closed loop stimulation pattern that somehow is hitting the olfactory bulb and measuring inhalation and measuring activation there, you could develop something that in a way replicates breathing patterns effects on these deeper structures as it goes through the amygdala, which the olfactory bulb has that direct input to the amygdala, and potentially see how different breathing patterns could be stimulated or how they could be monitored. And if you ask someone to volitionally box breathe, what is happening in the activity of the olfactory bulb.
Very cool.
Just more insight into how those deeper structures, as you said, not just cortex, but these deeper structures, involvement in something that's fundamental, but also under volitional control and not riding in the background, but potentially impacting our very emotional state.
You mentioned the amygdala. There's some interesting data coming out of Iowa from George Richardson's lab about SUDEP, sudden unexplained death in epilepsy.
I saw an update
and
on this.
they find that signals originating in the amygdala projecting down to pre-Butzinger could be responsible for the apneas that could be causal for SUDEP.
Wow.
Incredible.
I wanted to just come back to sighing real quick. You had that really cool example of evolutionarily how it might have benefited. I was thinking about my wife. Whenever I sigh, she zooms in and says, "What's wrong?" Right? So evolutionarily, maybe in humans, it's a bit about recruiting social support.
Well, no doubt. I mean, I don't mean to put a big wall around it.
No,
and say, it's only what I'm interested in. No, I mean, a lot of our communication as humans is facial expression.
Yeah, right.
And I got a little bit into that with locked-in syndrome, because locked-in syndrome, as you know, the individuals continue to breathe, but they can't move any muscles. And I mean, that's very interesting. And they can't volitionally change their breathing. So this maybe go back to what we were talking about earlier.
And it's an injury to the brainstem.
It's
typically
usually a massive stroke in the ventral pons
Right.
that gets the descending signals coming from more rostral areas.
Right.
But so here's the to me really interesting. Colleagues in Queen's Care in London were studying a patient who had locked-in syndrome and who communicated to his caretaker, normal intelligence, breathing very metronomically, asked him to hold his breath, couldn't do it, asked him to breathe faster, couldn't do it. And there was nothing that they could ask the patient to do that changed the breathing. And all of a sudden, the patient's breathing pattern went crazy. And they said, "What did you do? What happened?" And he said, "You told a joke and I laughed." And whenever they then tested, whenever they told a joke that the patient found funny, he had that breathing pattern. So what's clearly involved with respect to breathing is you not only have this volitional component, but you have an emotional component. And emotional control of movement is very important around the face. So if you ask someone with locked-in syndrome to smile, they can't smile. But if you're showing something that gives them pleasure, like a loved one, they'll smile. So, you know, and poker players have this thing that they have this non-volitional tells coming through a different pathway. And I actually have the thesis, which I've never been able to get anyone to test, is that great actors who you can believe are feeling the emotions they're trying to express are not doing it by faking it, that they're able to mobilize the projections to places like the amygdala,
Right.
which actually express it. And they're freaks of nature. So, you know, some people may learn how to do it, but you can say, you know, it's like when you look at a photograph, you could tell whether people are saying cheese or actually smiling.
Yeah,
You know,
right,
we're
right.
good
Genuine.
at detecting
Right.
that. So I think that this emotive component is rather important, and there's that emotive component of controlling breathing, which is vital, that you see in locked-in syndrome.
Yeah. Can we circle back to more exotic breathing patterns? Like, let's just state it, Wim Hof.
Let's do some of that while we watch what happens to heart rate while we're doing it.
Okay.
Does that sound cool?
Yeah.
Go on.
Go on.
Let's bring up one. I mean, maybe start simple with like,
Someone's calling you, dude.
You have a phone call.
thank you.
Los Altos. Can you describe Wim Hof to us?
I'm not really an expert, but it's rapid breathing for a short period of time, 20, 30 seconds, and then holding your breath and doing that several times. But that may be incorrect. So those people who are Wim Hof,
Fanatics.
well, I wouldn't be pejorative, but Wim Hof devotees, forgive me.
So, but what about like the feats that he's able to do and claim that it's secondary to his breathing pattern? Like, it's incredible and absolutely amazing.
Okay.
Is that possible? What's going on?
I think it's bona fide, but what's missing is the connection between his claim that it's something he was able to learn versus something that may be where he is on the spectrum of the way his brain is wired.
Right.
So to me, I watched Michael Jordan dunk a basketball, take off from the foul line.
Right.
No matter how many times I watch that, I can't do it. He can give me instructions from now to doomsday. I can't do it.
Yeah.
So I don't know whether Wim Hof is a Michael Jordan of breathing and is able to do things that most of us just can't do because we can't do it, or it's something that can be learned. Certainly, the ability to generate this breathing pattern does have a positive effect on a lot of people. I don't deny that. The mechanism may be related to blood gases. It could be related to some of those other things. I don't doubt it. But how much of it is Wim Hof in particular, and how much is directly related to the breathing pattern, I think is not fully sorted out. And I respect the testimonials of lots of people who say that it's powerfully effective for them.
Mm-hmm.
They don't doubt it.
Mm-hmm.
But what the mechanism is and why he gets these incredible effects on his immune system and whatnot, I just don't fully understand that.
Let me just if you could, I know it's a tough spot, but if you could answer yes or no, do you think that breathing in a certain pattern can ward off infection? Can it help you climb Mount Everest? Can it help you do some of the things that he's done that he states he's helped other people do as well? Is that in the realm of possibility to you?
I don't think you can climb Mount Everest because no matter how you breathe,
Barefoot.
the oxygen. Excuse me?
Barefoot.
Oh, barefoot?
Yeah, he did it barefoot.
I don't think you can climb Mount Everest even with shoes on
Right.
because the oxygen level is too low. And that's no matter how much you
That's a good
ventilate.
point.
So,
Yeah.
but can it affect your immune system? I think that's very possible. Now, how it affects your immune system, to me, would be the question is, it is affecting my immune system through my brain,
Right.
or is it affecting my immune system because I'm now alkalotic, maybe hypoxic, and that turns on my immune system.
Yes.
Remember, turning on your immune system for short period of times episodically is different than turning it on chronically.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know about high intensity interval training.
Mm-hmm.
Why is it effective? Well, my theory about this is that you become transiently hypoxic. That turns on these genes called HIF genes, for which they gave the Nobel Prize a few years ago, and that improves mitochondrial function.
Mm-hmm.
But only if you do it in short epochs. If you do it chronically, in other words, if you're chronically hypoxic, then it's bad.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a difference between short episodes that you could do once, a couple of times a day, or many episodes like what happened in sleep apnea, or chronically where you have some lung illness, then you get inflammation and then your immune system is not going to be happy. So the pattern in which you do it is important. And what I would like to investigate is to the degree that there are effects in something like the immune system, not something like, on the immune system, is it being mediated through changes in the physical pattern of breathing, through changes mediated in the brain,
Right.
or through changes just in blood gases?
Right. Yeah. What about pain? What's your insight on how breathing influences pain?
Well, I think there's good data that in schizophrenics, or at least in some schizophrenics, they say they feel the pain, but it doesn't bother them. So like if you have a toothache, when I've had a toothache, it bothers the hell out of me.
Mm-hmm.
A schizophrenic might say, yeah, I got a toothache, but it's out here. I mean, it's really painful, but it doesn't bother me. And so there's that separation between the detection of the signal, the conscious perception of that felt thing we call pain, and the way it affects us. And so I think breathing can have an impact, maybe not on the detection part, but on the response part. Okay, yeah, I got to, but it's just not going to let it bother me. I know that sounds rather glib.
No, I mean, when I stub my toe or if I step on a nail, the first thing I start doing is a specific breathing pattern and no particular reason whatsoever. Take a deep breath, big exhale, something that I naturally do that I think helps. But again, I'm not the breathing expert.
Okay, so that is not going to act on your immune system. That's too quick. But it could act on the pathways involved in pain.
Yeah, so that's the context I'm talking about.
Yeah, I would say more likely than not.
Okay.
More likely than not.
Yeah. Do you want to do some breathing patterns and see what happens to your heart rate?
Yeah, while we're kind of pulling this up, what would you say is a yawn as opposed to a sigh, as opposed to what is a yawn?
I don't think there's a consensus about why we yawn. I think the notion we use that for communication, this conversation is boring, yawn. So I don't say it's boring, I just yawn. I'm not interested, I yawn. I'm tired, I yawn. and you pick up that signal right away.
I'm trying super hard not to yawn right now. It's just like, because you got me thinking about it, not because it's boring, but okay. Sure. And if we could talk, since we're talking yawning and sleep, I
While
noted.
you're doing that, I'm going to box breathe just so we have it.
All right,
on the
box
clock.
breathe and then center it. Can you center it?
Yeah,
Or is
yeah,
this,
yeah, yep.
Is that your heart?
this
my
is
heart.
his heart rate? Yep.
No, I was talking about the picture.
And now,
Yeah. All right, so you're box breathing right now, and then I saw, we had Dr. Gina Poe on,
Sure, she's great.
and her point that I took away from our conversation regarding sleep is the locus ceruleus. It needs to be quiet in order for us to get good quality sleep, particularly around REM sleep. And clearly, on that other graph that we brought up, there's an influence on the locus ceruleus with breathing. Tell us about that influence and how maybe a specific breathing pattern when we're getting ready for sleep can help silence that locus ceruleus, if you're familiar with anything like that.
I think in general, engaging in a few minutes of breath work prior to sleep helps. So you just got to try it, see if it helps for you. I mean, you could see Instagram reels of Navy SEALs saying that's the secret of how they fall asleep.
Mm-hmm.
They do 4, 7, 8 a couple of times and they go right out.
4, 7, 8 is
Inhale for 4, hold for 7, exhale for 8.
right.
It's a variation on box breathing.
Yeah.
And there may be some subtlety about the way the brain responds to 4, 7, 8 that's
Mm-hmm.
different than box.
Mm-hmm.
But supposedly Navy SEALs are doing these kinds of breathing patterns, both to calm down, and you would imagine they get into stressful situations,
Mm-hmm.
and to help them sleep and they may be in situations where sleep is not something they casually go into. They say, okay, you got to go to
They have
sleep.
to go to sleep. Yeah.
So I would say, try it. And your point is it's low cost, no pain. Try it. If it works, it works. And who cares what the mechanism is?
Yeah. Yeah. That's a good point. Okay. What do you see here? So he's box breathing. He's been box breathing and quiet for once for the last 2 minutes. So what do you see on the heart rate graph?
He's not in a quiet room, so he's hearing the two of us speak, and he's probably bored to death. So that's going to affect his breathing pattern. You see, he smiled. Okay, so smiling raises your blood rate, your heart rate. But the initial thing is from starting from that peak. When you started to box breathe and you focused on the breathing part, your heart rate went down. I mean, I'm not surprised because you probably had more vagal output. So you have respiratory sinus arrhythmia. You have that vagal output during expiration, and it will increase during longer expiratory periods.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. Okay, well, what I want you to do is to get down below 70.
Understood.
Does that make you more stressed or less stressed? Look, it makes you more stressed. Come on.
I'll get there.
I mean, what would you recommend? Be a Navy SEAL, dude. Get your heart rate under 70.
I tried 4, 7, 8. Don't look. Don't look, because
I would close my eyes if I were you, dude. It's like watching the stock market, am I right?
oh, please. Now, don't pass out.
There you go, buddy.
You see, you
64.
did it. But not
Right.
looking at it. You're looking
Mhm,
at it, you got that
Yeah.
cognitive function going in there.
Yeah. So you were doing
4, 7, 8.
4, 7, 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I also, the whole concept of ujjayi breathing and you had mentioned before the sigh is the inhale that actually pops the lungs open, but I also wonder if the back pressure on a type of ujjayi breathing or closing the throat while you're pushing air out through the nose or mouth, whether that back pressure, you said it increases the efficiency of exchange or of every breath because you're leaving the oxygenated air in the lung for a little bit longer so more exchange can happen.
I'm totally ecumenical as to mechanism.
Yeah,
okay. I have some ideas about mechanisms, but it's not a contest that mine has to dominate everything.
Mm-hmm.
But what I do have problems with is people asserting that there's a definitive and strong evidence for something in particular when there may not be. So I try and couch what we're saying is these are ideas, these are hypotheses. There's lots of data I think that supports it, but when you're dealing with the public and they're, as you say, they're very interested. That's why you're doing this podcast,
right.
And you're an expert. When an expert says this is what we found, people just run with it, and some are more cautious than others. And the problem is when you're cautious and you give caveats or say, well, but it could be this or it could be that, and it could be just placebo effect, you lose the intense interest of the audience in what you're doing. And so that, to me, is I try and avoid that.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me counter that and maybe put you in a corner. If you had to give me or somebody else like top 3 breathing patterns that you say, I would try these, and if they work for you, great, continue doing them. They have all these amazing benefits that we just discussed. Or you can move on to the next one. Would you be able to provide those?
I would say box breathing and 4-7-8 to start, at least 5 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the place where you could see where it has an effect, where I first tested it, I was driving up to San Francisco and getting tired, and I pulled off the road and did 5 minutes of box breathing. I was new to it, and it totally rejuvenated me. After 5 minutes, I just sipped to San Francisco more alert than I was any part during the earlier day, and it was fantastic. And later on, a colleague in my department told me that many people have a postprandial depression after lunch. And what he found is if he did 5 minutes of box breathing, he was now coasting the rest of the day at high level and able to do work. And I adopted that because I was going into Westwood to get a cup of coffee at 2, 3, 4 o'clock, and I needed my caffeine. And instead, if I did 5 minutes of box breathing, it was better. I didn't get any caffeine, but I was rejuvenated for that period of time. So I'm convinced that short epics of something very benign can be powerful, but something like holotropic breathing really requires the willingness for a serious, intense physical effort.
Yeah.
But many people report afterwards to being exhilarated and psychedelic-like.
If you could just put the mic a little closer, the interesting thing about everything we were talking about here is that you likened it to different exercise programs for different muscle groups or different outcomes, whether it be endurance or strength or quickness. I have been getting the sense as we're talking that different breathing patterns could potentially create different outcomes. And some of the ones we talked about is relaxation, so the sigh and maybe slowed breathing, but then some other type of breathing pattern that's going to create an alertness, and maybe another one that's going to create a psychedelic experience. So to me, it's this profound playground of all these options that you never knew existed because you're just doing it all the time.
So there are breathwork gurus across that entire spectrum who will tell you that they have a particular breathwork pattern that is tuned for something. They might not have something that's all purpose, but and everyone has to find out for themselves now.
For example, that's what I was wondering. You get energy from your box breathing, right? But why, for other people, it's they do that before sleep and it helps their sleep. It helps them get to sleep. Like what's the variation in terms of response? Like what is that? I don't know.
No idea.
No idea?
No idea.
Just do it, and if it helps, it helps.
Well, there's the phenomenological thing. If it works, it works. And one of the things that we're trying to do with this mouse model is to really get at that. I mean, those are great questions. And yes, box breathing is calming, but when I was tired driving and I was motivated to be alert, when you want to go to sleep, you're motivated to go to sleep.
Sure.
When I was in my car at the side of the road, I was motivated, maybe subconsciously, to become alert. So maybe I directed the outcome in that particular direction. In other words, you may have your particular breathing pattern, but the ultimate effect may not be dependent on more than just the breathing pattern. It could be on your mindset.
Yeah, state dependent.
Yeah.
And that's interesting. You brought up the hallucinogenic experiences with holotropic breathing. And we know that's also an influence when it comes to psychedelic experiences, right? It's like set and setting is really important to someone's trip during their psychedelic experience. So,
or so you're told.
yeah, or so the data shows. So yeah, I can't help but liken, different kinds of breath work too, psychedelics in terms of their mental state changes.
Well, I would think that the slow breathing patterns are not going to be quite as psychoactive.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the possibilities is that psilocybin, for example, will affect serotonin.
Mm-hmm.
Psychedelics affect serotonin.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry. Box breathing could affect serotonin, or pH could affect serotonin. So they may ultimately have a convergent pathway by having significant effects on serotonin, either globally or in particular parts of the brain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I once published a paper on LSD and serotonin, but I'll save that for later.
No, tell us now. No? Okay.
Well, I'll tell you afterwards, and then if you want to, we'll do it the next time.
Okay.
Well, maybe
the LSD or the paper discussion?
Ecumenical,
So there's all these different breathing patterns and apps and guidance. I was in Jersey with my brother, and he showed me this one on the way to the gym. And
there's not anything called Jersey breathing?
Yeah.
What is that?
Like, sounds something like, hey, oh. Is that it?
No, it's like, fucking A. Fucking B. See?
Lots of size.
Hey, and welcome to 3 rounds of energy breathing. Inhale through your nose and exhale through your mouth. Sit down or lay down and prepare for breathing. Let's begin.
Oh, can't do that at the same time.
In, out, in, out, and breathe in, out, in, out, and follow the rhythm.
So, I think
welcome to 3 rounds of energy.
I think having access to this is great for someone who resonates with a white male in a forest snowy background. But if you search YouTube, you could probably find anything to fit your personal preference with similar instruction. And I think the key thing is to find something that you feel comfortable with.
Yeah.
As
I was doing the practice or just following the instructions with my brother, I felt self-conscious. It was just an odd style of breathing. That was the beginning, but it got faster. Then there were massive pauses. I assume it was a lot like Wim Hof. And as I was doing it, I could feel tingling. I could feel myself kind of change state. And while I don't know that I would practice that exact type every day or in what context, I realized that very quickly you can change your whole mental state just by breathing differently.
Which is, for most people, crazy.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah. VO2 max. If anyone has any sort of insight into that, it might be you.
No.
No.
because that really has to do with metabolism. Breathing is only, part of that. That is how much oxygen you can take in. But, people like Peter Attia just, pound the table that's the ultimate signifier of your health state. I don't know if it's the ultimate, but certainly I would imagine higher is better than lower. But on the other hand, if you look at the lifespan of people who probably have very high VO2 maxes during their 20s and 30s, they don't necessarily live longer. Marathoners don't live longer. And they have the Tour de France now. I mean, it's unbelievable what these people are capable of doing. I mean, Tadej Pogacar, the guy weighs 140 pounds and produces for 30 minutes what I could probably do for 30 seconds on a bike. Now I'm a little, I'm not in his demographic, but it's just unbelievable what some people can do. But so I think there probably is some validity to VO2 max. But I think the more important point is exercise. I think exercise is the best drug. Of all the things you could do in this world, exercise. Probably exercise, sleep are the two main things I would say to someone who feels that they need to improve their health state. Diet, probably the third part. And then things like breath work can be added on top of that. But, if you're not exercising, you're not sleeping, and you're eating lousy food, you can do breath work from now forever, and it's going to have
but breath work is involved, maybe not in eating, but in those other two, things with exercise, right? There's certainly breathing patterns that might help with exercise, and there might be a breathing pattern that might help with your sleep.
But the premise is you're already exercising, you're already sleeping.
Right.
Okay, so that that's the foundation.
Sure.
And then breath work can optimize it. Okay, which is certainly something we want to do. If you take it for whenever it is and you can improve it, and if it has a positive effect on your health, then do it.
Yeah.
Do it. But if you're not exercising, you're not sleeping well, and you have a poor diet, it's not going to be. It may help.
Yeah.
But you're really not doing yourself a favor.
Yeah.
But in that context, what if you went into hyperbaric oxygen chamber? I'm partially saying it in jest because I'm agreeing with your point that basically these extreme activities that may get incremental gains on top of somebody who's already pretty fit, doing well, or has a very specific condition like a burn wound or something like that. These extreme workouts or extreme trainings or therapies can add an increment of improvement. But if the fundamentals are not there, if that exercise and sleep and nutrition's not there, then don't waste your time.
I don't know what the percentage is, but if exercise takes you 0 to 80, maybe breath work on top of that could take you from 80 to 90. But if you're down at 20,
spend
you're
your
missing
time
out
somewhere else.
Yeah.
Go.
Anything else that you think needs to be mentioned as it relates to breathing?
Oh, geez, this has been a lot of fun, and I can't think of anything offhand, but let's think about it.
Well, what's the the next frontier? We talked about a lot of the studies you have planned. If there was one thing that you think is going to be the next frontier of the next pre-Botzinger, what's it going to be?
Well, we think we're on to understand the basic mechanism for rhythm generation. But as I said earlier, most people are not interested in that. It's like you can drive a car without knowing how the engine works, and I want to know how the engine works, but most people deep down don't really care. Whether or not we find paradigms that are then testable in other parts of the brain to help understand other functions like decision-making, speech, and cognition. But you have to understand, at my state of being, I don't think I'm going to be doing this for an infinite amount of time.
Mhm.
I used to, when I was your age, I felt it was infinite. And it's not even semi-infinite. So I really have to focus over the next several years while I still have the wherewithal to do it.
Mhm.
And so my goals are to go over the next hump with rhythmogenesis and to try and see if I can understand the mechanisms by which breath work is affecting emotional cognitive state and do it in a way that I can keep, through things like this podcast, get it out to people who could benefit.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not monetizing this. I'm not getting any glory out of this, but I get a lot of, I feel I'm doing some good by just telling people they should try this.
But you you do meet some pretty cool people. Tell us about the experience you had with Rufus the Soul before we leave.
Sure. So Matt White, who runs this podcast called Sing for Science, gets together a scientist and the musician who have some overlapping interest. So he calls me up, and I never listened to the podcast. I didn't know about the podcast, and says this band has recently gotten into breath work, and their manager thought it'd be a cool idea for you to do a Sing for Science with someone in the band. So I said, yeah, cool. And I asked the band was, and probably as a sign of my demographic, I'm a baby boomer. I had never heard of the band. It was Rufus the Soul. I mean, I looked it up, and the first thing I noticed is they went a worldwide tour, and that it's about 8 months after the initial conversation, already the Rose Bowl concert was sold out. So I said, there's something I'm missing here. It turns out, as I told you earlier, that I actually had heard a lot of the music because I have a Peloton, and they use their on the soundtracks. And when I mentioned it to my adult sons and their spouses, they would say, oh my God, they're my favorite band and whatnot. So I had no expectation for how this podcast would go. We didn't go over preliminary questions. And Tyrone Lindquist shows up, and I never met him, never even seen him. And I was expecting someone who looked like Axl Rose, sort of someone who was tatted with long stringy hair and, just wearing torn jeans. And he came, he's a very handsome man, very articulate and smart, which I don't normally associate with some musicians. Some of them are brilliant, but I was just expecting someone who was, way different. And he was very articulate. It was the band, I told you this earlier, my favorite thing that he said is that the band went from whiskey shots to ginger shots. And if you listen to the podcast, they really incorporated that in their way of performing, and they felt it really improved not only their musicianship, but their lives. And it was, they drank the Kool-Aid.
Breath work before the...
during performance, but
Wow.
before performance. And that, they... I don't know if you would call them wild and crazy beforehand, but they seemed to sort of calm down in ways that were consistent with the kind of music they were playing. You might think, well, you have to be a little bit manic, a little bit crazy to produce any sort of music, and that when they calmed down, they would lose their creative edge. But it doesn't seem that they did. And of course, their last album was called Inhale, Exhale, which should have been a hint that they were really into this.
Fascinating.
That's great.
I am still waiting on the manager to get back to me if she's listening, because I'm hoping to go see, because the Rose Bowl
We're going to get you
was,
in?
Yeah,
it was sold out. It was sold out.
Oh my
well, I wasn't
goodness.
going to get tickets. I can't get
some
tickets.
backstage
So
passes there, Dr. Feldman. Are you kidding me? 3, 2, 1.
Yeah, so we always end with a 3, 2, 1 closer. So 3 truths about breathing, 2 myths about breathing, and 1 thing anyone can do today to breathe a little easier. 3 truths.
all right. Breathing is fundamental to life. Breathing is much more than an act of getting in oxygen and getting out carbon dioxide. It interacts with your whole body. And breathing can profoundly influence your emotional and cognitive state. Two myths about breathing. You can increase the amount of oxygen in your blood by breathing pure oxygen. No, because normally you're about 99% saturated, and so maybe you go up a little bit. If you're an athlete and you've depleted that oxygen, maybe, but taking oxygen is not going to have much of an effect. If you have problems with gas exchange, yes, you need supplemental oxygen, but otherwise healthy people don't need it. God. I hope you edit this so my pauses are
No, we're not. We're keeping them in there. It means you're actually thinking about this.
God, you can see the smoke coming out.
What do people get wrong about breathing?
Oh, they think it's the mechanism generating breathing are trivial. That actually infuriates me, because if anyone gets anything from this podcast, they should realize that it's not trivial.
Right.
So I've often felt that colleagues who worked on things that I was once at a meeting where there were a whole bunch of Nobel laureates, a small meeting. And I'm sitting opposite one who was very full of himself. Not all Nobel laureates are, but this one was. And he says to me, Jack, you're a smart guy. Why would you ever choose to work on something as uninteresting as breathing? And I said to him, I won't mention his name, he says, you may have won the Nobel Prize, but you can't tell me how I recognize my grandmother. I'm going to tell you how you breathe. I'm going to solve a scientific problem you with your Nobel Prize have not. He has never spoken to me since then, and I'm sure I won't be surprised at an annual basis he writes to the Nobel Committee with a denomination.
Let me just say something.
And wait, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, but I have three.
Just piggybacking off of that, I tried to harp on it before, but I really do think that the mechanism, the synchronization mechanism, reflects something that's bigger than each of us and ourselves, and maybe it reflects something that maybe connects all of us and connects us with nature. And I think it's something that I came to learn of on this podcast, and I thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I mean, when I isolated, we interact. And that synchronization is a metaphor for that. It can be literal and it can be metaphorical. And certainly the metaphorical is very important in how we do things. And, if you talk about politics, we're very desynchronized right now.
Oh, yeah.
And regardless of where you stand on that spectrum, we got to get more synchronized if we're going to move forward. Now, you asked the one thing, give breathwork a shot. Do something simple, do it for a couple of weeks. If you don't do it, you've lost very little. But if it does work, I think you'll gain something of significant that will improve your life.
Incredible.
Awesome.
Any final words?
No, I think just to zoom. And this is the hard thing about doing science and making it interesting, right? Is you zoom so far in to such a small part of the brain or a small problem. To zoom out and talk about the repercussions, implications of this and how it might impact our lives makes me think about, even preparing for this podcast, every breath I'm taking. As soon as I start to think about it, I feel like I don't even know how to do this anymore. How am I supposed to breathe after knowing as much as we know now? It's like when you take that millipede and you say, how do you coordinate all those millions of legs or thousands of legs? And it could never walk again. Just the thought of how complex it is to breathe makes it difficult for me to take that next breath.
Fortunately, that doesn't stop you from breathing.
No, it does not.
Incredible. Dr. Feldman, thank you
Jack.
so much. Jack.
Sure.
thank you so much. An honor having you on. We look forward to all the work that you're going to do in the future, and are very thankful for all the work you've done thus far.
And I hope that the interval for the next time we do it is not too long, because I want to make sure I can come back.
You know how long this one was? The interval?
2 years?
3 years.
3 years.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. It was
Yeah.
3
It
years?
was 3 years. Yeah. Yeah, we'll have you on very soon, I think. We'd love to have you back.
Well, it's a delight talking to you guys. It's very enlightening to me to see, people at your status and knowledge of the nervous system and your perspective, and to talk to you about this, and the fact that you're even interested. I mean, I wish more of your colleagues had that same genuine, sort of almost childish interest and curiosity.
No.
We lose out on curiosity.
It's what we say after every one of these. We're talking about, hey, look, it's hard to get people interested in the facts and the details and the minutia, but if we get them curious about themselves, it's not a protocol that's going to make them better. It's the curiosity to ask a question, to look at the observation of what happens when you do breath work, and to modify it a little bit, to learn more about it and learn more about yourself.
But we don't cultivate curiosity.
No.
Mm-hmm.
No.
And I realize I'm sort of an oddball in the fact that I got into what I'm doing because I was curious.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't want to make money. And I didn't want glory. I was just curious. I mean, it was entirely, about me. I was curious.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out, just by pursuing that, I have had and do have a pretty good life.
Yeah.
So I feel I'm very grateful.
Yeah, before almost every podcast over the last 3 times, we've just told each other, like, can you believe that, we get to do this, we get to talk to the people that we talk to, and be physicians and taking care of people. I think we're very thankful and grateful for the opportunity to do this, that you would come on and that you would share your knowledge with us. And I think we do what we do because we're genuinely curious. And then we want to impart that curiosity on our patients and as many people as we can.
Well, bless you for that, because, you're doing what needs to be done.
You're the man. Thank you so much.